I'm Michael Scharf, for those of you who don't know me. It is so nice to see so many people who loved Henry King coming out for this. Now we're going to hear from Professor John Barrett, who is the biographer of Robert Jackson, who was Henry's mentor and hero. And so it is appropriate that John be able to give us his perspectives on Henry.
I had the great privilege of moderating a panel, Henry's last group experience, speaking with two of his fellow Nuremberg prosecutors, Whitney Harris and Ben Ferencz, both of whom wish they could be here and are men who have cried as we've spoken about Henry in the months since May, and that alone tells you a lot. It's a dwindling fraternity of former Nuremberg prosecutors, and it's been special to be admitted to it ex officio through Henry's friendship. I have to thank Case for this invitation, President Snyder, Dean Rawson, Professor Scharf, but I must tell you that I had already been invited to this event by Henry T. King, repeatedly. Now, he did not want this event to occur, I guarantee you that. But, rationalist that he was, he realized that there was a certain inevitability, and he hoped and assumed that his friends in this institution would do right and convene this event. And he directed me to be there and to speak about Nuremberg and about me, Henry King, and Case. And so I'm going to do that. Luckily, I was invited, so I didn't have to throw elbows to get to this microphone. Regarding the latter, Case Western Reserve University, I can make short work. Case was Henry's home. It was a place of achievements and happiness for him. It, of course, had complications and frustrations. Henry King was in midlife when he joined the full-time faculty here at Case, and he continued into, of course, old age. Only health, only mortality stopped Professor King from being in a classroom this fall. He loved the students of Case Western Reserve University, and I know some are here. I teach, many of us teach or have taught at various points, and one of the things Henry always took conversations to very quickly was the students, and then he would brag about how he had the best ones here at Case. He would talk about special colleagues and relationships. Many are in this room, and I don't mean to omit anyone, but I know Jonathan Enton, who was his suite mate for decades, and Henry would talk to me about John. Michael Scharf, whose arrival and collaborative energy in the last years, Hiram, others, meant so much to him. Henry's world was corporate, commercial, and international law. The law of modern human rights included therein. But Nuremberg, in his teaching, research, writing, and speaking, was his passion and his identity. And his time here, that sort of 1980 and forward period, was a time when Nuremberg, was still very much eclipsed by the Cold War. And when people, including here at Case, some people may have been inclined to think of Nuremberg, and thus of Henry T. King, as more of a piece of the past, even a relic, than a vital and thriving piece of our future. That frustrated Henry King at many levels, including because he always knew that his time, as against the permanent significance that he believed Nuremberg embodied, was finite. And he wanted that future, while he was still here, to be part of it. And this is going to be a happy speech. Let me turn to Nuremberg. Henry King, in his days of Nuremberg, was Harry. I asked him about that once. Why does everybody of that generation call you Harry? He said, because that's a better name, but we just kind of outgrew it, and nobody's called Harry anymore, so I go by Henry. But he was Harry King in his youth, and in February 1946, he was a young married man. He'd married Betty Mae Stanton, also of Meriden, Connecticut. They were living in Manhattan. She had a secret job, which he later learned was connected to the Manhattan Project. He, a graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School, was a young associate at Milbank Tweed. In that winter of 1946, he decided to leave the big machine, nothing like a Milbank of today, but a big corporate Wall Street law firm, and go out on his own in a smaller practice where he could really be a lawyer. And the Kings, Harry and Betty, had friends over for dinner on a Sunday night, his law school classmate Ted Fenstermacher and his wife Nancy. And the Kings said, "Great news, Harry's leaving Milbank and going out on his own." And the Fenstermachers probably kind of looked at their shoes and each other and said, well, we have some news too. Ted's going to Nuremberg to prosecute Nazi war criminals. Well, guess who won that showdown? Can you top this? I think not. Well, Ted's news at the end of that evening became Betty's prodding. And Henry would always gesture like this. She was in my back, prodding me, telling me, there is a world out there. We've got to be part of it. And just being a small firm New York lawyer or a courtroom New York lawyer, that's not it. And that prodding and that encouragement soon had Henry on the steps of the Pentagon. And by the end of spring 1946, had him hired to join the Jackson staff and what would become the Telford Taylor staff for the subsequent proceedings at Nuremberg. And that's Henry King, the dapper fellow in the three-piece suit, second from the left, standing on a pile of rubble in Nuremberg. His colleagues there include on the far right a fellow named Jim Conway, who I was lucky to meet. When Henry arrived in that spring of 1946, the international trial, the big trial, the four-nation Jackson, Goering, Hess, Ribbentrop trial was ongoing, and Henry was thrown right into various projects connected with that. He lived in the Grand Hotel, which was the center of Nuremberg, rehabilitated and restored by the American Army, the center of social activity, and he had a room there. He was entirely unsupervised, and that was good for a self-starter like Harry King. He found things that needed doing, and he did them well. This is him in his civilian uniform. He didn't have a military rank, but he had, of course, to pass guards and live in an occupied area, so a uniform was de rigueur. This is Henry. Here you see him on the left, leaning back and smiling, at a dinner he convened in the Grand Hotel that summer. This is a Yale alumni reunion dinner. Yale at Nuremberg, one of its oddest chapters. And the fellow in the glasses in the back left corner of the table is Justice Jackson's son, Bill. He was his father's executive assistant. He was Henry's law school classmate and lifelong friend. As a self-starter, Henry helped that trial finish, and he helped the next work get off the ground. It included interviewing some of the defendants who agreed to be interviewed about others who were in the queue to be defendants in the subsequent cases. And thus Henry, with translators and stenographers, interviewed Hermann Goering before he took his life in October of 1946. He interviewed Albert Speer quite a few times in September of 1946, and that became, of course, a relationship that was renewed when Speer finished serving 20 years in Spandau and became the basis for Henry's book about Albert Speer. In the Taylor phase, General Telford Taylor heading an American-only prosecution effort in Nuremberg, the first case in the queue was somebody who should have been a defendant in the big trial, Erhard Milch. He was the commanding general of the Luftwaffe. He was Goering's principal deputy. He was called as a witness and cross-examined by Jackson in the big trial. And the only reason he wasn't a defendant was too many of the American prisoners were already sort of stealing the limelight from the British, French, and Soviets. But Milch alone was the first defendant to be prosecuted in the subsequent proceedings. And in those 12 subsequent trials, the Milch case was the only one-defendant prosecution. And Henry King, as one of the core members of that trial team, participated in building that case, in prosecuting that case, in cross-examining witnesses, and in winning the conviction of Milch. This is the American prosecution table, and at the front right corner you see Taylor. And next to him you see Henry King, and across you see Clark Denny. And that's Milch. And you see the American prosecutors again in the background. This is Milch hearing the verdict of guilty, convicting him of war crimes and crimes against humanity for his supervisory organizational command responsibility over the use of slave labor from concentration camps in the aircraft production that kept the Luftwaffe in the air for as long as they managed to do that into 1943 and 1944. Now that's the legal dimension of Henry King's Nuremberg, but it also had a personal dimension. After 4 months in Nuremberg, Henry King wasn't alone there. His wife, Betty King, joined him in the fall of 1946 as a dependent spouse. She had to go through incredible bureaucracy from their apartment in the Bronx to bases in Brooklyn and eventually by ship, the Goethals, which crossed, and it was a rough passage, and you can imagine the seasickness and so forth. But she got there, and somehow, I never got to meet Betty King, but there's something amazing in this little anecdote. Somehow, in her weight allotment, in her luggage, she brought a Jeep. They paid $400 for it somewhere in New York, and that Jeep was their mobility in occupied Germany and elsewhere in Europe during Henry's remaining time. And they had occupation army privileges. Nuremberg was tough and it was gruesome and the evidence was scalding and the principles were high, but frankly the perks of occupation army service also weren't so bad. Once Betty arrived, Henry left the Grand Hotel, and they got an apartment, a beautiful 2-room, second floor, 2-balcony, well-furnished place, with a maid, with a chauffeur to drive that Jeep. And after the Milch trial, which filled months and was grueling, they had some breaks and took some trips, weekends in Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps, up and down through Switzerland. I can't find a place in Switzerland that they didn't visit. Up and down Italy. And in their long marriage, which had some hard challenges, including, as has been alluded to, their late son, Hank, Henry T. King III, and his special needs and education and the great expenses that were involved in his care, Henry said that he and Betty were never happier than that year, that horrible Nuremberg experience of a prosecutor as a happy husband. When he left in fall 1947, when they left in fall 1947, Betty was pregnant. Hello, Suzanne. She wrote, I love this too, that it had something to do with a weekend trip to the Zugspitze. Nuremberg for Henry King thus was about achievements, it was about participation in history, it was about high principles, it was also about personal happiness. And it was about substance, it was about law. It was about law as an alternative to war, and the possibility that building on Nuremberg, that could be part of the progress that the world would make. And in the last decade of Henry King's life, that idea and Nuremberg and he became huge and relevant again. The Cold War ended, which made possible the United Nations tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda, and the Rome Conference, at which you've heard Henry played such an instrumental role, leading to the statute, which was ratified by a sufficient and broad world community, not yet including this country, that created the International Criminal Court in 2002. And in Henry's words, at that panel that I moderated just a year ago, he put it this way: "What I am saying is this: I am in the autumn of my life, perhaps the late autumn. I don't know, although I hope I have a few years left. As I look at it, Nuremberg was the most meaningful part of my life. I don't say that in a selfish stance. We have to sell young people on the substance. Peace is a concern of all persons who are going to be here on the planet and want a world in which weapons don't destroy men. We want men to control weapons. That's the important thing." And as Henry King worked on that substance in the years I knew him, in the many articles and speeches and presentations and legacy that he has left us, it was about those things, future and children. And thus I show you one more image. That's Henry King, and again the rubble of Nuremberg, and 2 small children. Spring of 1946. Henry, like all Americans in that occupation army, hated the Nazis and the Germans for what had been done. But he loved the children, of course, and he loved the future. And it's all there in that photograph. Children, innocence, hope, potential. We'll deeply miss our friend, but with his life and lessons, we are well equipped to continue Nuremberg's and Henry's and Law's and what has always been the future's work. Thank you very much.
The next speaker to be the first American chief prosecutor of an international tribunal since Robert Jackson at Nuremberg. It took 57 years, but let me introduce to you David Crane.
Well, it's good to be back at Case. I remember giving the Klatsky lecture here once upon a time, and I had just finished, or I was getting ready to have dinner with my good friend and colleague, Henry T. King, Jr., who was a great American lawyer. He was my friend, he was my mentor, and he was our colleague. On behalf of the 12 living prosecutors in the world, I want to extend to the family our deepest sympathy, but also our great respect for our colleague. On behalf of the chief prosecutors of the International Criminal Court, Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, Cambodia, and Lebanon, they all extend to you here in Case their highest regards. And last week we had the privilege of assembling many of them who were there, and of course we read what we call the Chautauqua Declaration at the end of those dialogues, and each signed that particular piece of paper. It's a rare piece of paper. There are only 3 in the world right now, but we left a signature block empty that said Henry T. King, Jr. In memoriam. So he's also on the 3rd. He signed personally the first Chautauqua Declaration, the second Chautauqua Declaration, and he was a big supporter of that group. I came back, I flew directly from Freetown, Sierra Leone in 2004, November of 2004, and landed here in Cleveland, Ohio. And I was excited to be here to give the Klatsky lecture, but I also was excited to kind of rekindle my association with Dr. King. I'd known him professionally as a professor, and he had actually been on one of my panels back in the 50th anniversary of Nuremberg. But I wanted to sit and chat with him because I wanted to get his sense of what it was like at Nuremberg and how did he handle the horror. Because I was literally up to my elbows in blood and gore and death in Freetown, and I wanted to know how did he handle the situation in Nuremberg. And this is where I think a rare gem that those of us that really know him, he got this twinkle in his eye. I was trying to be serious, and I was interested, and Michael Scharf was there as well. And I tell the story because it is Henry King. I'm tired, kind of down, starting to unwind. I said, Henry, how did you handle Nuremberg? And he kind of looked at me and sat back and said, about 2 scotches a night. And I immediately relaxed, and we had this wonderful conversation about dealing with these kinds of terrible things. But he had that great smile and that wonderful, wonderful chuckle, which I am listening to as I speak right now. I'll just leave you with a couple of things. Henry King was a passionate supporter of the International Humanitarian Law Dialogues, which this great law school is a sponsor. And he would pound the table. The spirit of Nuremberg lives. Every time, the spirit of Nuremberg lives. And that's Henry King, too. Passing on that torch, not just to those of us who've had the privilege of seeking justice for those who have faced atrocity around the world, but also to the students at Case and the students at Syracuse and the students at St. John's and all of the universities that are moving these programs forward. Henry T. King is someone who will be a rock for all of us. And at the end of one of his speeches at the Chautauqua Institution, he looked at all of us and he said, reach for the stars. Thank you.
Well, we've heard a lot about Nuremberg today and Robert Jackson, and our next speaker, Greg Peterson, is the chairman of the board of directors of the Robert Jackson Center in Chautauqua.
Thank you. I'll be brief, Michael, because I know the mind can absorb only what the rear can endure. To Suzanne, David, friends and colleagues, I start. David, is the red light on? Are we going now? I just had, driving down from Jamestown, New York, a surreal experience. What was that? I grabbed a CD of Henry's very special 1991 trip with his son, David, to Germany to interview Albert Speer and Frau Junge, which became the basis of his book, The Two Worlds of Albert Speer. So I'm tooling down 2 hours worth of Henry King talking in my ear, David working the sound system, and they're having this wonderful interview with Albert Speer and Frau Junge. What insight. It was remarkable. And it was just a magic moment for me because it harkened back to the beginning of a relationship between Henry King, Robert Jackson, and this fairly newly formed Robert H. Jackson Center, which was created in 2001. We're up in Jamestown, New York, and our mission is to advance the legacy of Justice Robert H. Jackson. And we wanted to do something special our first year, 2001, and we wanted to focus in on the Nuremberg trial, of which you've heard much. And we started musing. In fact, one night I mused with a fellow Chautauqua Institution board member named Marty Coyle. Marty Coyle was general counsel for TRW, and he said, hey, a guy that used to work at TRW, Henry King, you need to know him because he was at Nuremberg. He can be a participant in your event. I didn't know Henry King from Adam, but I went home, did what anybody would do, called directory assistance. I called Henry King, I introduced myself, and I said, would you be willing to participate in the first ever conference at the Robert H. Jackson Center? And the quick answer was yes and hell yes. And here are some people who you should call immediately, and we did. So off we went. 3 days later in my mail was an outline. And then there was a call that said, Greg, will this do? What else do you need to know? And here's how I would suggest we plan this. Ultimately, through the moderation of Professor Barrett, Whitney Harris, Bernie Meltzer, James Conway all came to the Robert Jackson Center, and this became a C-SPAN moment, all kind of directed in front of and behind the scenes by one Henry King. We got off to a wonderful start at the Jackson Center. 2 days later, I get a call from Henry King saying, or I get a letter from Henry King saying, hey, that was wonderful, thanks so much for participating, and by the way, I have a suggestion for the Robert H. Jackson Center. Perhaps you should have a seminar entitled The International Humanitarian Law Dialogue. Now, David Crane's here, and David Crane has been the impetus behind 3 of these now up at Chautauqua. Henry was many years ahead of this, David, and I found the letter just yesterday. We were slow on the uptick, but I'm glad he gave us that inspiration. He felt closely akin to the legacy of Robert Jackson, and I'll tell one quick story. It was an event here, and we were invited down, and Michael did one of his big dog and pony shows, and there was lots of people, and Henry was the principal speaker, and we came and we presented to Henry as a thank you, a portrait of Robert H. Jackson here at this particular event. And he was very grateful. He put it up in his office. Now, here's the real story. Shortly thereafter, Michael tried to see if he could have Henry donate that portrait to Case. And the answer was no and hell no. It was Henry's, and that's the way it was going to be. On behalf of the Robert Jackson Center, there are so many firsts that I'm thrilled that Michael asked me to come down and participate, because I must tell you that there's a close relationship. Case Western, Henry King, Robert Jackson Center. Henry was our first Law Day speaker the next year, our first webcast, our first major event at Chautauqua Institution, where he spent 3 days talking to a elder hostel group, and I brought a bunch of these down because this became our first publication, Henry King's Reflections on Nuremberg. It was remarkable. He was our first senior advisor. He was our first speaker at the Robert H. Jackson birthday celebration in Warren, Pennsylvania. He's the first guy on the Robert Jackson website. I interviewed him. He was the first interviewee. He was the first on YouTube. I might add, if you go on YouTube and you type in Robert H. Jackson Center and you scroll down and you look for case number 2, what you'll see is you click, you'll see 2 shots of Henry King at Nuremberg. It's sort of cool. And he was closely aligned, of course, with several who were fellow colleagues at Nuremberg. On a more serious note, when Henry passed away, there was a letter from fellow Nuremberg colleague Whitney Harris, and I would like to read that. In all that he accomplished in his lifetime, Henry King put the destiny of his country first. He gave every measure of devotion to America and its noble purpose to lead the world to peace, freedom, and democracy. Henry King has helped to make America a stronger nation and the world a safer place for humanity. I salute my lifelong friend, Henry King. That was from Whitney Harris, who is 97, and I talked to him today, and he sends his regards and memories of Henry. Finally, Henry was a participant in the first and the second International Humanitarian Law Dialogue, and as David mentioned, the fact that he signed in memoriam, we left a blank space for him at the third. But his final remark and his final sentence of the second International Humanitarian Law Dialogue was this: you have got to keep your eyes on the stars, live on hope, and keep idealism about the future. We have a special responsibility because we are a free society, a society where dreams can become reality. We have the American dream, which becomes a reality in the business world. Let the American dream become a reality in the international world. To David, Suzanne, the red light is on, and his legacy continues on through all those he touched. Thank you.
Our next speaker is the second of two distinguished figures in this room who have received our Klatsky and given the Klatsky lecture. Eli Rosenbaum, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, heads the office in the Justice Department that used to be known as the Nazi Hunters, and now their portfolio has expanded to be Rwandan genocide and Cambodian genocide and Yugoslav genocide.
You're taking my time.
So go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you, Michael, Suzanne, Dave, Dean. For many years now, one of the very first things I see each morning when I arrive for work at the United States Department of Justice is an 8 by 10-inch black and white photo. You actually saw it here before during John Barrett's presentation, of a not quite 28-year-old Henry King seated at council table next to Brigadier General Telford Taylor on April 16, 1947, as the judgment convicting Field Marshal Erhard Milch of war crimes and crimes against humanity is about to be announced by a U.S. military tribunal at Nuremberg, Germany. That framed photograph occupies a place of honor on the wall of my office in the Criminal Division's Office of Special Investigations. Framed right next to it for more than a year now is a second 8 by 10-inch print, this one a color photo showing Professor Henry King, by then 89 years of age, chatting with me in Chautauqua during a break between sessions at last year's International Humanitarian Law Dialogues. The sight of those two wonderful photographs provides me with enormous inspiration, literally on a daily basis, as my colleagues and I continue to work to secure a measure of justice on behalf of the victims of Nazi crimes against humanity and victims of more recent atrocities from Rwanda to Bosnia and beyond. As it was for Henry King and his colleagues at Nuremberg 60-plus years ago, the work is extremely difficult, both, one might say, technically and also emotionally. And just as it was for Henry King and his fellow Nurembergers, the work requires a determination, indeed almost superhuman perseverance. That last requirement was perhaps most notably demonstrated right here in Cleveland in OSI's decade-long effort concluded just this past May to remove former Nazi death camp guard John Demjanjuk from the United States. However, the perseverance and tenacity that the women and men of OSI brought to that case was surely dwarfed by that which Henry King and his Nuremberg colleagues brought for more than half a century to the battle to realize their dream of achieving the establishment of a successor court to the International Military Tribunal, a permanent international criminal court. Henry never gave up when fighting for a noble cause, even one that, like the ICC battle, seemed to be nearly a hopeless quest, decade after long and fruitless decade. And if continuing the struggle required that Henry get on a plane, say in his 9th decade of life, and fly all the way to, say, Rome, Italy, to apply his great moral authority and prodigious intellectual and persuasive gifts in person, well, so be it. That's precisely what he did. Never give up. That was the message that Henry King communicated whenever we met. He understood from difficult personal experience the challenges and frustrations inherent in human rights law enforcement work, and he never failed to inquire about the status of the Demjanjuk case and our other prosecutions. He cared deeply about the cases and especially about the victims. Through his words and through the example of his amazing life, Henry always succeeded in bolstering my spirits and in recharging my prosecutorial batteries. In my professional life, there surely could be nothing better than an attaboy from Henry King. Oh, how I will miss those warm expressions of encouragement. Henry's many extraordinary contributions to international criminal law during and after Nuremberg, and his passionate and tireless dedication to the pursuit of justice on behalf of the victims of crimes against humanity made him without doubt a pioneering and towering figure in the history of the worldwide human rights movement. And he inspired so many people. I will never forget being in this room, I guess it was 2 years ago, one of the wonderful programs that Michael and the Cox Center put on here, and Henry was speaking. And there were a number of us in the room that were moved to some tears by what he said and how he spoke. But seated next to me was an African, I believe, LLM student who was weeping. And I had to console him. I had to, it was an amazing experience. Henry had that effect on people. I think it's important to note that Henry's stellar service at Nuremberg, both at the first trial, in which he assisted Justice Robert Jackson before the IMT, and then in the subsequent proceedings before U.S. military tribunals, and after that, his work on the Marshall Plan, all of that was performed as a federal public servant, that is, an employee of the United States government. To those of us in federal service today, and I guess I'm today's representative of that group, those of us who pursue justice on behalf of the victims of human rights violations, Henry King is a magnificent role model. His accomplishments remind us of a time of far greater confidence in public service and in public servants as a force for improving the world. In a commencement address last year, then Senator Barack Obama encouraged his audience to enter public service. Quote, "At a time of so much cynicism and so much doubt, we need you to make us believe again," he said. Friends, Henry King was a member of that fabled greatest generation whose myriad good works surely made us believe again. Accordingly, it's especially on behalf of Henry's countless admirers throughout today's legion of federal public servants, and particularly on behalf of my colleagues at the Department of Justice, that I want to extend heartfelt condolences to Henry's loving family. And more than that, I want to express abiding gratitude for Henry King's exemplary and remarkable service to humanity. If, as Michael said last week at this year's Humanitarian Law Conference at Chautauqua, the age of impunity for international criminals has at last been replaced by an era of accountability. That historic result owes in no small part to this gentle but persistent man who battled indefatigably and against very long odds for a world in which, as he liked to put it, the law of force would be replaced by the force of law. Henry King never gave up, and for that, humankind, and especially imperiled peoples the world over, must be profoundly and everlastingly grateful. His example will continue to inspire all of us. Godspeed, Henry.
Please now join us for a reception in Henry's honor just down the hall in the rotunda.